Hi, you're listening to Sustainably Geeky. This is episode 87. I'm your host, Jennifer, and as a reminder, you can find us on Buy Me a Coffee if you'd like to support the show, YouTube, and anywhere you listen to podcasts. Today, I'm excited to be talking to songwriter and author Alex Woodard about his book, Ordinary Soil. And just as a warning, we will be discussing topics such as suicide, addiction, and trauma, so please take care if these are sensitive topics for you. So, Alex, thank you so much for joining us. And can you start by giving a brief synopsis of the book and where your inspiration for this story came from?
Well, thank you for having me. I think that the book is not something that the message is not something I would have generally written about, and it came from a very random source. When I was at the start of the pandemic in Fiji, I was surfing there with a small group of people. There was supposed to be a big group of people, but the coronavirus had kind of started to happen, and it was like early March, and some of us went, some of us didn't. And on that island, while we were there, California shut down, and we were all kind of looking at each other, going, "Okay, well now this is a thing." That was kind of when the airports closed. We knew something was up, and we were kind of scrambling to get repatriation flights. And there was this guy on the island who was the medic, or he said he was the medic, and he said, "Hey, if you guys want to know what this coronavirus deal is about, I can tell you." And he had a captive audience. We weren't going anywhere, so we were like, "Okay, great, I guess. I don't know what this EMT is going to know about it." But it turned out this guy was a triple board certified physician named Zach Bush, who was there with a friend, and that's why he was the medic. He was just kind of designated that on the trip. And he gave us this, like, he whipped together this PowerPoint presentation in like a matter of hours about the coronavirus. And that it was fascinating. And that was just a story for another time. But he told us all about that, and the conversation kind of veered into what he was doing now. He was kind of focused on chemotherapy, but he had shifted his focus to like the core root causes of disease. And we got to talking about it was kind of a Q&A back and forth about, wow, what does that look like for you? Because by then everybody was all in because he was such a brilliant guy. And he started talking about, and this is not the sexiest of topics, but he started talking about the history of chemical and mechanical farming on human health and planetary health. And he said that's what he had started focusing on because he believed that, chronic inflammation, which is true, is the root cause of a lot of chronic disease. And how do we get to that place? Well, we get to that place through the food we eat, and it kind of evolved into this enough where I was like, "What is this guy about?" So I was able to get a repatriation flight home, and of course, when I got home, I looked him up and did a little more research, and thought that this story about the history of chemical and mechanical agriculture was fascinating for one thing, and it was the kind of story that I thought a lot of people needed to hear, but most would not, because nobody, well, not nobody, but very few people are going to go searching for that kind of thing on YouTube, right? They're not looking for that kind of entertainment generally. But it was such an important story that I had the idea that maybe if I fictionalized this concept, maybe it would reach more people, and maybe it would get to the kind of folks that actually needed to hear it the most. And so I proposed that to Zach. I said, "Look, would you want to collaborate with me on this? I have this idea about this multi-generational like farming family on the same piece of land in the Oklahoma Panhandle that goes from like Choctaw roots all the way up to present day, and maybe that would be a cool way to tell the story of how we've handled the land over the last 150, 200 years, and how that in turn has impacted our health and the health of the planet." And he thought it was a good idea, and Ordinary Soil was born. I mean, it was, the narrative itself didn't take too long. The research took a long time, and I did a lot of. If you go to the back of the physical book, there's like, I don't know, 3 or 4 pages of like NIH studies and all sorts of resources that I had researched. to make sure I was on the right path. So when I would be kind of getting to the more technical sides of this, I would bounce them off Zach, and he'd say, "Oh, go look at this study," or that's kind of how it went back and forth. But it was really important for me, as you know, if you've listened to the book, not to have that as the core focus. The core focus is really the story of this family and the generational trauma that they go through, and how that is tied into the way that they are working the land. And it's really a story of inputs equaling or affecting outputs. That's really, at the end of the day, what it's about. But that was the genesis of it. It was, up till then, I hadn't written anything like this was actually my first novel. I'd had some success with nonfiction up to this point, but this was my first shot at fiction. So I had a lot of fun doing it, but it was quite a lot of work because of the research involved.
Yeah, I honestly thought you were coming from this from maybe a personal experience, or you knew someone, and that kind of thing. So to hear that you learned about this as a result of the coronavirus and kind of, meeting someone by chance is really fascinating. And it kind of goes to show like we can all fall into topics or fields that we don't expect from the most, random places.
Yeah, you never
But
know.
yeah,
You have to be open to it. That's the thing. You just got to be open to it. And
yeah.
in this moment, with the pandemic, obviously everything's shut down, and I was like, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to do
Hmm.
this.
Yeah.
It's just taking a shot. So yeah, it is sort of a lesson in that. If you just kind of stay open and follow the cues, sometimes you can end up in a really cool, different kind of place.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Ordinary Soil, the book, covers a broad spectrum of social and environmental issues, some of which you've already mentioned, but including things like industrialized food production, the opioid epidemic, chronic disease, and intergenerational trauma. So, at a glance, all of these things may not seem to be connected if you were to just look at the list. But in the story, you really show how they are connected and how it's important to see these things intersectionally. So, can you talk about that and why? I guess how that works and why things are interconnected and why it's important to look at them holistically and not just kind of one at a time.
Yeah, that's a really important word, holistically, because I always took that word to mean, I mean, some kind of new agey wellness like jargon. I never really looked at it in terms of what it actually means, right? Which is involving the whole system. And that's really what the book is about at its core. It's about how everything affects everything, and that sounds very broad and very general. But in this context, there's a very, and I think that we see this in our own lives too. Um, I guess an easy example would be that if you're having, let's say you're trying to get healthier in what you're eating, and and you're trying to lose weight, or maybe you're trying to get in shape, or maybe you're trying to just start feeling better. And so you start changing your dietary habits, right? And that affects how you're feeling, right? How you're feeling impacts how you're moving through your day, which impacts how you're dealing with other people, which impacts how you're seeing the world, and how you are doing your job, and how you're relating to your spouse or your partner or your friends or your dog or whatever. All of that's connected to this one change you made to make yourself feel better. So that's a very kind of simplified version of the bigger context of this book, which is that starting at the very beginning, the book starts. I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the book starts with a suicide attempt, and then it goes in present day, and then it goes back in time to I think the 1850s or 1860s, to the Choctaw roots of this family, the indigenous patriarch of the family. Um, and from the very beginning, you start seeing how one thing leads to another, right? How they've had this particular way of life for a long time, but and he has this patriarch loses his wife, and he's got this kid, right? He's got this kind of this son that is his focus and his joy. The son gets taken away, and goes to a school for assimilation. And my family's Choctaw going way back. On my grandmother's side, my maternal grandmother. That's why this was a particular interest to me, because her dad was a full blood Choctaw, and then it kind of descended down to me. And I actually, we can talk about this later too. That's a big part of this story. But anyway, his child gets taken away, and that impacts him, right? That affects everything that in the way that he's looking at the land. It impacts how he's living. Obviously, getting sent to this school affects the child. He ends up coming back to his dad really angry. And his dad's about to die, but he comes back very angry. That impacts how he ends up working the land because he's mad. He wants to increase yields. He wants to prove the white man wrong. He's going to go and do this, right? And so that he goes at it with all the resources he can acquire to make the land produce, which is fertilizer and all sorts of chemical inputs. So that's kind of the where it starts, and you can see how one thing leads to another just in terms of that son deciding to show the white man wrong and increase his yields and build this life that nobody thinks he can have. To do that, he has to damage the land. He doesn't know it at the time, but that's what he's doing, right? As he works the land more and more, and this is getting into be a longer story than it needs to be, but as he works the land more and more, the topsoil goes away, and you can't get much out of the land anymore. We have the Dust Bowl, we have a migration west, and so all of these things are interconnected, and it's kind of hard to. It's always kind of hard for me when I'm writing to pin down the one thing that caused something else, right? Because that's not how it works. The web that we are in is woven way more intricately than that, and it's kind of one of those things where, as I said at the beginning, everything matters, and the one change that you might make in your life right now is going to impact a whole array of things, positively or negatively, depending on that change. That's really what the book is about. It's about, as I alluded to, the inputs equaling the outputs, or being very affected, by the outputs are very much affected by the input. That might be what you're listening to. That might be what you're eating. It might be how you're handling a relationship. All those things end up mattering. In this case, it's really focused on agriculture. Because that's such a big story, especially now, as I'm sure we'll talk about, the way that our food system works, and the health of our farmers and all that. I mean, it's gotten to sort of a critical mass, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I felt like the story needed to get out there, because we haven't run out of time yet, but we are approaching that.
Yeah, I really found it fascinating how, like you said, you described the relationship of 5 generations of this family to the land, and how we start with the patriarch, who is very close to the land, traditional, does everything kind of like his ancestors, and then just from one generation to the next, you see a huge change and progress in air quotes. He uses the technology of the day, and it ends up messing a lot of things up, but you see each generation coming a little bit farther away from the land. But you also, interestingly, kind of see each generation have a little bit of regret towards the end of their life over what they've done or how they've managed their relationships or something. So that's an interesting kind of balance as well, where they kind of know that they've gone the wrong way and they want to make amends towards the end. But
Right.
I guess the intergenerational trauma plays a big role in people's lives, and there's a lot of studies about that as well. How our bodies do react to things that happened generations ago, or how it can affect in ways that we don't even think about. So that's just something else that I thought was interesting to think about, on top of all the other, the
Oh yeah.
opioids and the chemicals and the inflammation and all the stuff that gets thrown in there on top
No,
of that.
I was literally just thinking about this morning. I was surfing, an hour before we talked, and thought about exactly what you just said, because I was remembering how I did an event with Zach. I don't know. It's not that long ago. It was probably 3 years ago, maybe. And he was talking about epigenetics and
Mm,
people, which is what you're referring to. Basically about how trauma can get passed down through our genes. And he was he was talking about it, and people I was looking around at the audience, and like most of the people were looking at him like he was, crazy. Like, what the hell? What? This doesn't this seems a little out there. And then in the last, maybe year and a half or 2 years, the research has gotten so overwhelming, and it's accepted in the scientific community that like epigenetics is a thing. You know,
mm-hmm,
Zach was maybe a year ahead of the curve on talking to people about it. It's been talked about for years, but only now are we really starting to see that's a real thing. The passing
mm-hmm,
along of that kind of trauma, all different kinds of trauma, from one generation to the next. Um, it happens at the genetic level, which is just, it's both scary and fascinating,
mm-hmm.
and also kind of, there's a bit of hope in that, because that if, you make some changes in your life now and you start living better, so to speak, you have a good chance of not passing that trauma down to anybody else. But man, it's funny you mentioned that, because I was just thinking
Yeah.
about it an hour ago.
Yeah, no, that's just something that occurred to me reading the book was, wow, this is like a great example of that, whether we knew it or they knew it or not when they were, the characters.
Right.
So speaking of farmers, obviously the main character in the book is a farmer, and all of his families have farmed this land, as you said. But a lot of times when we talk about food production, farmers are vilified because of how they've come to farm the land with chemical intensive monocrop farming methods. But this story is a little different because it humanizes the farmer and kind of shows how he comes to terms with these things, and he's realizing maybe this isn't the best way, and you can see him struggling and fighting against it. And you can kind of imagine people in your own life having the same reactions that he's having. But I guess, can you talk about the context of how farmers came to be caught up in this system where they are just using tons and tons of chemicals, and it's also putting them in a lot of debt, like they're basically dependent on the chemicals that they have to keep paying for forever because the land just can't sustain itself anymore.
Yeah, so really, it's about, I talked to a few farmers about this. One in particular that we can talk about in a bit, but it really comes down to survival, right? It's making a living. It's trying to. This is what my dad has done. This is what I have to do, and I've got to keep this going. How do I keep this going? And a big part of the book, which which was really important for me to communicate, was that a lot of these guys don't know that they are doing harm, or this degree of harm, right? In the moment, they're doing what they have to do to survive. They're not thinking that they are ruining the land for their future yield, and that's not the mindset. They wouldn't be doing it otherwise, but they've got to do what they have to do. And a lot of these technologies, in terms of chemical, um, inputs, are presented to them in ways that are safe. They think that this is okay. And that was really, like, especially like in the 70s and 80s kind of years in the book. That's when the tide kind of starts to turn, and I really wanted to like paint this picture of these guys doing what they had to do to make this work, and not really thinking that there would be the kind of consequence there would be, because the way that it was, these things were sold to them was not, harmful. They were thinking that this was Roundup's a great example, or glyphosate. It was a safe chemical, and even now, with all the evidence to the contrary, you'll still hear people saying that it's totally fine. The reason that it got to this place is just m- more like a math equation than anything else. I mean, you start with healthy topsoil, right, 150 years ago, and you are continually killing it with these chemical inputs and the mechanical inputs, the way that the way you plow and farm and actually work the soil. Um, you're degrading it generation over generation over generation. And as you do that, you need to add more inputs to get anything out, right? So you have to add in more, for example, if you're this is like I really hadn't thought about this, and it makes until I researched it, but it makes so much sense. You've got a plot of land, and you've worked it to the point where it's not producing, and so you have to add fertilizer, right? So the fertilizer helps your crop grow. It also helps everything else grow, like weeds and that kind of thing. And so then you say, "Oh my gosh, okay, now I have to add this pesticide and this herbicide to the land to kill the weeds so I can grow the crops, right? But that also kills the soil even further, right? And so you get into this cycle of having to add till you get to the point of kind of the latest generation in the book where this guy is like throwing everything he can at the land and he's still not getting any kind of yield because it's kind of reached that tipping point where he's not going to get anything else out of it. He's been doing basically monocrop, as you referred to earlier, over generations. I mean, it's been happening. In this case, I think it's corn and wheat, right? It's winter wheat and then it's corn, and there's no time for regeneration. There's no time for the soil to rest. It's just boom, one thing after the other. Over time, that just the land can't handle it, right? And it's very similar to a person, which is where you find the main character as he's contemplating suicide because he's been doing the same thing, right? He's been adding these chemical inputs um, that work for a little bit, but then they don't. So he's got to add more to himself, and then he's got to add more to, and then he's got to add more. In this case, it's with he's drinking a lot, and he's got a problem with OxyContin, and he just keeps adding and adding and adding until it's just you hit the into the rope. And so it's kind of interesting to me how the land mirrors the man in that sense, and that was a really important thing for me to try to highlight. But that's basically from the people I talked to, all the research I did. That's the simplified version of what's happened. It's just you keep throwing stuff at the dirt until it just can't take anymore. And that's where a lot of these farmers get to this place. Also, the guy that I spoke to in particular, which is he's kind of loosely who I based the main character on in terms of committing suicide because he had tried himself and twice, and we talked about that and why and how he got to that point. And you can't really speak for entire populations of people, but I can speak for him. And in terms of what he was, the stories he shared with me, and that's what they were about. They were about him farming the same land that his dad did, that his dad had, and him not being able to get any kind of production out of it and feeling like a failure and feeling, like he was going to be the guy that was going to lose the farm. And so you have those kind of like mental and emotional and social pressures as being from on the farming side, not even mentioning whatever impact the chemicals that you're using are having on you, as a on your like physiology, which is a whole other story. So you have both your exposure to these chemicals and you've got the social pressure of keeping things going when they're not going anymore. For him, that's what kind of combined to cause him to try to end his life. And from talking to him, and he's talking about his neighbors, and he's talking about the people he knows. His story, sadly, is not unique. It's something that has been very kind of rampant through the heartland, through the for I mean, since he's been going on down a different path for about the last 15 years, I think. But he was seeing that like particularly in the early 2000s, it was a very sadly um, common occurrence, and I think I just looked recently at the statistics, and I think that farmers still have the highest rate of suicide in the U.S. By profession, which is like, who would have thought that? That's not something I wouldn't have chosen that group. So that really tells you something in terms of the land and the human, how
Hmm.
intertwined and interconnected they are.
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising, but it's not, I guess, when you go back and you think about how, like you said, they've just been kind of doing what they thought was best practice all these years. Maybe the scientists, government has told them this is going to change your yields and whatever. And yeah, maybe it did in the short term, but in the long term, they did more damage, kind of like the drugs you put into your body. Maybe it makes you feel
Exactly.
good or takes away the pain for a little while, but in the long term, you're breaking a lot of systems down. Um,
Exactly.
and it's a really tragic, because I know in the U.S. it's an issue. But also around the world you hear stories. There's an epidemic of farmers in India and other parts of the world that are so locked into these, this cycle of using chemicals and then having to get the next seed because nothing else works and it has to come from this GMO company. And it's just
Hmm.
maddening, because it's like nature has a way to do this, to grow food easy.
Yeah.
Like, it's figured it out. And here we are coming along, adding all this stuff, paying all this money when we could just do it the right way for free. But, we have to, it takes a lot of work to get back to that system now.
It really does. And I think you're starting to see a shift, which is cool. And it's not, I mean, it kind of started with the organic movement, and now you're seeing like food in the supermarkets branded with regenerative, which is
Mm,
crazy. I mean, in a good way, but like that's
yeah.
amazing for, like I've seen rice and a few other products branded as regenerative. And so when you start seeing those kinds of things, I remember there's a little bit of hope, and I think that it's like turning a ship, a huge ship in the ocean. It's like it takes a little bit of time to get that
Mm,
thing
yeah.
turned around. But Zach brought up, and I wish I could give you the exact numbers, but in a talk that we did together, he brought up a really interesting point about the organic movement, which is, I mean, some people there's some pushing and pulling with whether or not organic is really all good or not, but it's a step forward for sure. And he was saying, we were talking about how organic foods were making their way into like Walmart in the U.S., for example, which is a big deal. Like when you start, if there's a market in Walmart for organic foods, that's a big step, right? And he was saying that it was actually a really small percentage of consumers that would require to kind of tip the scale in terms of buying organic in order to make it way more profitable for other farmers to get in and to start doing it, right? That's what this is about. This is about, like, of course, health and land and human thriving. Um, but it's also about making a living and making money. And if a farmer can make more money doing organic or regenerative agriculture, they're going to do it, right? It's a big push. And so his point was that, like, it was a very small percent, like if 10% or maybe it was 12% of the consumer choices in terms of food went to organic, like if it got to that point, then the market would open wide up. Like get very, very big, a lot bigger and a lot broader, for farmers to kind of step into. And it was a really interesting way of thinking that it doesn't really take that much on the consumer side to make a big difference. And I think we're seeing that now. That's like I said, that's why you've got Lundberg regenerative rice, at Vaughn's here in the U.S. That's a big deal. And so that is, in my mind anyway, that's a step in the right direction. But it is really hard to do, especially, with here in the United States with these families that have been doing it a certain way for such a long time, and then they have to sell out to a more industrial complex oriented kind of approach. Either themselves or they actually sell, obviously, to industrial
Hmm.
agriculture companies, just to be able to survive. That's kind of where that's where the really hard thing is, in as far as I can see it, in terms of stopping the momentum, right? When you've got that much momentum behind you of that industrial complex and the government supporting it here in the States, that's difficult. But like I said, I do not think that we are like I don't think it all is lost. I think that as consumers start making choices, different kinds of choices,
Hmm.
the market wants to serve that, and
Yeah.
that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's the other side of being in a capitalist society is if the demand is high enough, then maybe we will get these healthier
Yeah,
options. And the organic certification system has issues. I know, like it's hard and very onerous in some ways for
yeah,
farmers to get that certification. So
right.
whether that's the route they go, or like you said, the regen, uh, description. That's interesting though, because that's encouraging to know that that's coming. That might be the next
Yeah,
thing in food.
I
It's
saw. I mean, not to interrupt you, but I saw an
no.
ad on like we were watching like a football game or something a couple nights ago, and
Mm-hmm.
there was a regenerative agriculture ad on TV
Hmm.
about the rice. Like it was crazy on a for
Wow.
an NFL during an NFL game, right? And so that's something. That's like
Yeah.
okay, maybe there's a little foothold here, where you're not going to reach everybody, and you never will with these things. But man, if you can get just enough folks to say, all right, you know what, I'm going to try making a change in how I eat and how I consume, and I'm going to, try this out. That's a big deal. It's a really
Yeah.
positive stuff. I mean, I looked at my wife when that ad was on. I was like, "What? Are you kidding? Like like nobody, like I bet you like 0.0001% of the people watching this ad know what regenerative agriculture is.
Mm-hmm.
But they're putting it out there, and which
Yeah.
is cool.
And maybe they'll search it because they heard that weird term and they're like, "What is this?" And then might pique their
Totally.
interest.
Yep.
Well, since we're on the topic, my next question is about these new farming systems because, as we learn about these harms that the industrialized farming system causes, there is a movement to return to indigenous and regenerative land practices. So, how can these approaches help to improve the environmental and human health challenges we're facing? As you mentioned, there's a lot of parallels. So what are some of the benefits of, or I guess maybe even how does it work to start?
Well, yeah, that's a big question, and it depends on where on the planet you're located and what you can farm and that kind of thing. But generally speaking, like I'll give you a simple example from indigenous culture, which I talk about in the book, which is this Three Sisters approach, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
I tried to do recently and I totally failed. So I'm hoping
I've
that
also tried it and failed for different reasons.
yeah,
So
it's hard, right?
I
But I
blame
think
the
if I get on,
birds.
yeah, totally. I think if I get on it earlier this year, I'll be all right. But anyway, the point is that in that way of farming, you plant these three different crops together, basically, right? It's corn, beans, and squash. And so, as the corn grows, those beans have something to wrap around as they're growing, which is the corn stalk, right? And then as the squash grows and spreads across the ground, it covers the soil. It prevents water loss and protects the soil. So you have these three different crops working together. Um, and I've seen it done, and it's really cool. And like I said, when I tried to do it, it did not go. I was close, but it just did not happen. But the idea is that you're using each different crop is helping the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're done, you are turning over that soil. And in a modern regenerative way, what would happen is you would plant something or many things, whatever's native to your area that grows in that particular season, right? And when you harvest it, generally you would plow it under with using some means other than ginormous tractors, and you'd let that soil rest. You might put a cover crop over it to protect it, right? Which is just a spreading some sort of spreading vegetation until the next season. appropriate growth pattern, whatever that be. The reason it's hard to explain is because it just really depends on what part of the world that you're in. But the idea is that by doing, you mentioned something quite true earlier, that nature already knows how to do this, right? And so by by eliminating the chemical inputs, um, you're much less likely to have uh, things growing that you don't need to be growing there, which ironically eliminates a lot of foreign pests and weeds. It's really, really amazing what can happen when you let nature do its thing.
Mhm.
It's incredible. And so, from a regenerative standpoint, and I'm not a farmer, but like the idea is to use what works in your area, just help it. You're helping it along. You're not forcing it, right? You're allowing whatever that is to grow. And then harvesting and then turning over and seeing what's coming the next season. That's in a gist. That's what it's about. That's a difficult thing to replicate on scale. At scale, people are starting to do it a little bit now, but certainly on an industrial scale, that's a really hard thing to do. But the idea is that the market will pay for that kind of approach, right? The market will pay for a more mindful, healthier approach. And it goes, it's like it's organic already, right? And the regenerative thing is it's already taking into account an organic approach because you're not using pesticides, you're not using any kind of herbicides, you're not using fertilizers generally. Um, so you have your the result is like a healthier, more flavorful food, and which is obviously going to be better for your body, and it's going to taste better. And the hope is that the market's going to be willing to pay for that, right? Because it's going to come at a premium. Like it's like buying organic. Organic costs more, and it's the same with this concept, right? It's a difficult thing you can't just like, and that's the other part of this is that if you've been doing like monocrop farming for a long time, you can't just like turn it over and just start doing this regenerative process. Like it generally takes 2 to 3 growing seasons to get something happening. And I talked to this farmer about it quite at length because it's all he does, and it took him 2 to 3 years. And once he got there, he was able to start harvesting and he was able to start selling at farmers markets and to some restaurants and to some other suppliers that that enabled him to make a living, which is what it's about. But these are small scale things, right? The larger scale is the challenge. And so I think that I don't know how Lundberg is doing it. Like that'd be an interesting thing to research and see like where they're sourcing their rice and who's growing that regeneratively. That'd be pretty cool to see. It might be a good model to kind of follow. But that's the idea. It's letting nature do its thing, guiding it along a little bit, helping it, instead of forcing something, right? And we've been forcing it for a long time, right? We've been forcing, monocrop fields of ethanol based, like intended for ethanol type corn products, and it's obviously gotten us to a pretty desperate situation. When we haven't even talked about the Roundup glyphosate, the Roundup Ready seeds, and that whole situation, which we can talk about if you want. But the answer is, I don't know. I kind of look at it as like dialing it back, and the challenge is dialing it back in a way that these farmers who are doing that can make a living and survive. Um, that's the challenge, and so like I don't think that our entire here in the U.S. I don't think our heartland is going to convert completely to regen agriculture. I don't think it's going to happen. But if enough of our land is used for that purpose, if we get to that tipping point, I think that we'd be in much better shape. Like we've been saying though, it's getting these changes happening on a broad scale is really hard. Like it's turning that ship in the ocean. It really starts with the individual, right? And that's something I was trying to communicate in the book. Like your individual choices, how you decide to live, is like that's what you have the most control over, and that ends up having an impact on a bigger scale because other people see how you're living, and other people get inspired by the way that you're moving through your day, and that inspires them. So that's like it's the best way to do it, is to look at your own choices and maybe make a few different ones. Because if you start thinking about this too broadly, it's very overwhelming. I mean, we have a lot of people to feed in this country, and where you are too. Obviously, I mean, it doesn't just happen by people growing food in their backyards. I wish it did, but that's something you could do. As we just talked about, something I tried to do. I mean, we've got like we try to eat as much as we can off the land here. That did not work out with the Three Sisters thing, but we do have lots of gardens and grow lots of vegetables and try to we do it seasonally and kind of try to incorporate as much of what I learned in that book into how we are living here. Um, but it's not easy. Not everybody can do it. Not everybody has the space. So these are. I wish that there was a blanket solution for this, but everybody's situations are so different that really it's about, in my view anyway, it's about your consumer choices. I mean, your choices in terms of what you're eating and what you're watching and what you're listening to and all that. That's where you got some agency,
Mhm.
and that's where you can really make a difference.
Yeah, and in doing so, you're increasing the demand for this type of food, and then
Yeah.
encouraging the
Right.
farmers to do it, the right way. We have actually interviewed a couple of regenerative farmers or people doing this kind of work, so I'll link to that in the show. But one of them
Oh,
was
cool.
James Rebanks and Soulfire Farm up in the northeast of the U.S. And the things that they really impressed on me was like everything in a regenerative farm has a purpose and helps something else,
Mm.
kind of like you said with the Three Sisters. So like if you have cattle or other kind of grazers
Oh,
in the
right. Of
farm,
course.
they're helping to like poop and put nutrients in, and then they're stomping stuff into the ground. So it's fascinating because things in that you wouldn't think, what does that do? It has a purpose and it has an input. And then as you were talking about the chemicals, the pesticides killing the bad bugs, I thought, but it's also killing the good bugs. And that's
Yeah.
also part of regenerative farming is those bugs that might eat the aphids or the things that you don't want, the ladybugs or whatever, they're helpful as well. So that's, I guess, another downside to, among many, to the
Right.
chemicals, the constant chemicals. It's just, it's a constant maintenance thing. Yeah, you're
Yeah. No,
constantly
it's
having to
true.
keep up with it. So I would
Right.
like to talk about the Roundup and the chemical resistant seeds like you mentioned, because I think that's a big part of the problem as well.
Yeah, it really is. I think that in the book, I think it's like the '90s, like that generation's kind of when the Roundup thing really starts kicking in because glyphosate had been around for a while, but the company making Roundup, which is on the hook for billions of dollars, they're owned by Bayer now, but billions of dollars in lawsuit settlements. Um, they engineered this seed that was resistant to their to glyphosate, which meant that you could spray as much as you wanted and not worry about killing your crop because it was as it grew, it was resistant to the chemical that was doing the killing. And so what this seemed like a great idea because and it was kind of the start of the genetically modified situation. um, it seemed like a great idea because you didn't have to be careful anymore, and you could use farmers could use glyphosate or Roundup to desiccate, and which is really one of the biggest problems. And what that means is like when you're harvesting wheat, for example, like you tend to want to harvest it all at the same time and evenly, right? You wait till it dies, and it's kind of a timing thing. With glyphosate, you could spray your whole field with it, kill the wheat all at the same time, and then harvest it. Right? It was much easier and much more efficient, and it was supposedly safe. So, like that's like wheat's just one example. There's all sorts of Roundup Ready seeds for all sorts of different kinds of crops. Um, and so, obviously, as you spray, you're going to have some residual on there when you harvest, but you're also just pounding the land with this chemical. And so that was really like the the beginning of the end, so to speak, in terms of our healthy practices for growing food. Was when farmers realized that they could desiccate with this herbicide, and uses, I wish I had the number. I'm trying to I think it's like 300 million tons a year now, or pound, I can't remember, of what's sprayed now. And the thought was that glyphosate was safe because the mechanism that it used to kill the plant, for example, was different than the mechanism that it would use to be harmful to us or to other living beings, or the microbiome, which is what you were referring to, the soil microbiome, all that good bacteria, all that stuff in there. Um, but and it gets very technical, and that's a book that if you want to get into the weeds on, no pun intended, there's a few really great reads about this out there. But at the end of the day, their research wasn't as complete as we would have hoped. And so um, glyphosate is still used quite a bit. It's not used, for example, like in Canada, like certain countries have said that they're not going to use it anymore. But it's still used here. It's still sold at, Home Depot to, get the weeds in your driveway out. And it's just a really dangerous chemical. And that's just one of them. I mean, there's many, but the idea that you are genetically modifying this natural thing to be able to withstand this, chemical aggression is just in itself that's a difficult thing to wrap your head around if you're trying to live in a healthier environment.
Well, and then
But
you just end up with super resistant bacteria and viruses,
yeah,
or pests
that's
or
right.
whatever. Like you create
Super
something
wastes.
that's, yeah, like I think you talk about in the book, the farmers, they
Yeah,
keep having to up what they're
yeah,
using or get a more dangerous potent chemical because, oh, this thing stopped working because the plants
right.
figured out a way around it, and it's just
Just like the
maddening.
human body, right? It's just like the
Yeah.
human body, like we talked about. You can a little bit, used to do a little, but a little didn't do it, so a little got more and more, right? That's a Guns N' Roses song, and that's like about heroin, and that's the body. Human body is the same way. You keep a little
Mhm.
bit works, and then it doesn't, so you need a little more,
Mhm.
and then you need a little more, and a little more, and that's where we're at. Like you said in the book, I talk about. I get a little bit more technical here and there in the book, but like I talk about the super weeds and like how
Mhm.
these incredibly aggressive weeds become resistant to the glyphosate. So you got to spray more and more and more and more until they're not even working. So then what are you going
Yeah.
to do? You're going to have to find it's this really dangerous cycle that we found ourselves in.
And meanwhile, you talk about this in the book. All of these chemicals end up in the water that people
Yeah,
are drinking, and you
yeah,
see a host of medical issues just in this one family. But like the community, the
hmm,
doctor in this book, he kind of starts out, like, oh, everybody here is obese and type 1, 2
right,
diabetes, and all of these things, and he's a little like annoyed because he's almost giving the impression that they're lifestyle choices or that
yeah,
they're preventable things. But then as he starts
hmm,
getting more educated and looking into it, he sees the connections between, oh, actually these farmers are using this terrible poison and it's just eating it and
right,
drinking it every day, except for this
right,
one person who makes her own food, grows it,
right.
organically, and as you said, the choices she makes are reflected in her health.
Yeah, exactly. And you can that's the wife of this guy that the main farmer in the book, and she's kind of looked at as in this particular community as like an outsider, right? She's looked at as kind of like a kind of hippie woo woo type person because she's doing, she's living off the land the best she can, but it shows up in her life, how her degree of health, and she tries to take care of her husband, but he's so resistant, and it really comes down to these choices, like the plant doesn't have a choice. Like we are doing these things. We are making the choices for the planet, right? Um, and it would be really great if we could start letting the planet make its own choices again.
Hmm.
That's kind of like another message of the book is like you said earlier. I'd be fascinated. I'll check out your talk with the regenerative farmers because I would be really interested to see how they. I don't know. That's going to be a cool thing to listen to because
Mm.
as you were talking about your discussion with them, I was thinking, I'm also like in the next book. It's a little bit more about the regenerative approach and this farmer trying to figure it out or like getting a little help
Mm.
and the use of animals is huge, right? And
Yeah.
it's like you can use like the pigs in a lot of regenerative systems. They use pigs to root and forage, right, and like dig up basically the earth, and they fertilize as they go along. But everything's got a purpose, like
Hmm.
as you said earlier, and what a great way to live. Like what a great way to like live like your own life, let alone like treat or farm your piece of land. I mean, it's really, to me anyway, it goes back to how you started this conversation, which is the word holistic, right?
Mm.
It's incorporating everything, and because everything helps everything else, which is also what we talked about right at the beginning. It's like one thing matters to everything else, right? It's just about making those decisions and those choices that are in line with your values and what you want your imprint to look like in the world. That's really what it comes down to. But I'm not completely I'm not I'm not a pessimist in the sense that I think it's too late. I think that the fact you and I are talking about this and lots of other people are talking about it and people are actually doing it, the awareness is part of it, right? But awareness is only a little small sliver of things. Now you got to kind of move into the doing something, which we've talked about before. I think doing something involves, as individuals, it involves our choices as consumers. But um, I don't think all is lost. I think that there's a degree of hope out there that we can turn this thing around.
Well, that's encouraging to hear, and I think part of building the awareness is the storytelling aspect of it.
Yeah.
And storytelling is known to be one of the most effective ways to communicate these big, scary issues, rather than just yelling at people and saying the world's on fire, we need to do something. You
Hmm.
need to humanize it and kind of show personal stories and how it impacts people and how it could impact
Right.
you someday. So how did you find the balance between humanizing this problem in the book while also supporting it with hard science? Because that is a fine line to walk, and I think you did a good job of kind of not going too far in one direction or the other.
Oh, thank you. It was definitely a balancing act. I wanted the reader to be entertained by the story. I mean, entertain is a tough word, but like I wanted the reader to be engaged in the story to the point where they didn't even realize until maybe in the last few pages there was another message in there, right? And so I was constantly going back through the narrative and and trying to to deliver each message in each generation in language appropriate to that generation, if that makes sense. The way people would be talking about this in the 1930s or in the 1970s or in the 1860s or whatever. Like I was very, very careful about that until we get to the end of the book, and you reference that doctor when there is a bit more research out there, a lot more. There's a lot more. There's a much bigger body of work we can look at to support, the need for change. And so I got a little more specific, as I'm sure you noticed in, the last, I don't know, handful of pages of the book as far as what's actually happening out there technically, because the language exists now to talk about it, but it didn't exist back in 1947. You have to kind of shift your thinking as a writer and talk about things in relative languages, and so that's kind of how I did it. I just made sure each generation was framed in a way that made sense to that generation. And But it was a balance. I definitely did not want to write a medical journal or like have something that turned off most of the population in the first couple chapters, because they're like, wait a minute, I didn't want to be, reading a bunch of words I can't pronounce, right now at 9:30 at night in bed. So I wanted to like build the story to a place where those words made sense by the time you get to them. And if they don't, you can. I was very careful with that too, as you could tell. Like I didn't get overly technical. All that information's in the resources in the back if you want to see it. But it was definitely a balancing act. It was from a storytelling standpoint, because I had to. It was a constant revision, is what it was. It was like I went back and
Hmm.
read over and over and over again.
Yeah. And I think it's compelling too that it's a farmer having this journey instead of someone that's already, I guess, in the know about this stuff, or an elite person
Yeah,
who's trying to tell you what to do. It's like an average person you can kind of see yourself in, or you can see a family member. Maybe you're even a farmer reading this and you're like, oh, I have noticed that the land's doing this, or that I've got this medical issue, or whatever. Maybe it's connected, and it just sets off that light bulb of, okay,
yeah,
maybe I can start doing something different, or looking into this,
yeah,
whatever.
yep. Even if
Um,
there's just a little spark, that's all we're looking for, is a little spark. Like, okay, maybe, I see myself in this. That was the
yeah,
idea.
yeah. Well, I know we've talked about a lot, so over the last hour or so. I guess my last question for you is, what do you hope folks take away from this book?
Well, we've kind of been circling around that for the last hour or so, which is really like you do have a certain degree of agency in terms of both your health and the planet's health, and it's really important to understand you have that power. Like that's a very it's something that gets lost, I think, a lot when we talk about these higher level big agenda kind of issues. You think that the individual doesn't have much power, and you do. You have an incredible amount of power and depending on your situation, of course, but in the choices that you make, and what those choices look like. And so I would say that that's kind of the biggest message of the book. It's this idea that what you're putting in is going to greatly affect what you're getting out, and that matters in everything. That applies to the land and the soil. Obviously, what you plant in the soil is going to impact what comes out of it, right? It's the same as what you're putting into your relationships, into your brain, right? Into what you're reading, what you're watching on TV, what you're eating. All of that stuff you generally have some degree of control over. And so I would hope that the message from the book, like the main central one, is that, I can I can make a change here. I can have some agency in how I'm moving through my day, and that's going to impact, as we've said, holistically, a whole other host of things. It's really about giving the power back to the individual, because, as I just said, when you're thinking about this globally, um, it seems like too big of a thing, but it's really not. It's all of us together, not making a choice together. I'm not saying we're all making some kind of group think mind hive kind of choice to move in another direction. It's about you making a different kind of decision. Just you. That's it. And it doesn't even have to be that big a one. If you want to like if you don't have any, like a backyard, you don't have anything, and you want to see what it's like to grow something. If you have a window, you can do it, right? You can like you can grow some herbs or a small plant or whatever on that windowsill, and that'll give you some connection to how the planet is serving you, right? It give you some idea about how this actually works when you see that green shoot coming up from the soil. Just seeing that, I've talked to several people who just seeing that has an impact, because they're like, wow, I planted this thing in this little cup on my windowsill, and all of a sudden there's something coming from it. In some cases, sometimes you can eat it, right? That's a big, big line of connection to draw.
It's like
between.
magic.
It is, man, and
Yes.
it's like it really is, and so that's like the one thing. If you want to like do something actionable, I would suggest people try doing that, and that is not out of the realm of most people unless you don't have a window or some natural light somehow. Even if you don't have natural light, you can still do it. But that kind of connection is so small. How small it looks, just a single pot with a single shoot coming out. It can be massive in terms of how it changes the way that you look at the world and your connection to how things are made and what you're putting in your body. Like
Mhm.
it can be really surprisingly life changing just throwing something on your windowsill. So I'd say that that would be the one actionable thing that might be interesting for people to try. But past that, it's just your choices,
Yeah.
that's what I hope people get out of the book. Like your choices, good and bad, they matter.
Yep, that's a great takeaway. And I've really enjoyed our conversation. I learned a lot, from the book. And I guess, are there any other resources you would share with folks? I know you said you did a lot of research for this, but any I don't know, podcasts or books or anything that you would point them to if they want to learn a little bit more about
One
this?
place, yeah, one place I would look is Zach Bush has a nonprofit that kind of like serves as a bridge for farmers trying to get into the regenerative agriculture movement. And it's called Farmers Footprint. So if you just say it's just farmersfootprint.us is the website, and there you can see all sorts of stories about what you and I have been talking about.
Okay.
You can see stories of success. You can see stories of failure. You can see stories of, it's just, it's a really, their gift, I think, is in presenting the storytelling from the farmer's perspective. So
Mm.
I would go check that out. There's Stephanie Seneff. I think that's how you pronounce her name. She wrote an incredible book that's kind of the Bible for the glyphosate question, and it's slipping my mind now, but it's in the book notes, so I can send that to you. What
Okay.
the name of that book is, but I look at Farmer's Footprint because that's kind of like what we've been talking about in terms of storytelling. They do a really good job of bringing the story of the American farmer and globally. It's just not in the U.S. Um,
Hmm.
they do a really good job of kind of communicating what these folks are going through, what they're trying to do, what the options are, what the problems are. Like it's a really good one-stop shop. So I'd send people there. I think it's really quite interesting. And then there's one more thing that you could look at. I don't have a link for it, but one of the things that actually inspired the whole book, the one piece of media that I tell people about is a video between. It's a conversation. It's an animated video of a conversation between Zach Bush and Rich Roll, who's also a podcaster, and he it is the history of chemical and mechanical farming in the U.S. Again, not the sexiest of names, but it is really, really, really great in terms of telling you, okay, from taking a timeline and explaining what happened between, mid 1800s and now. It's
Hmm.
it's great, and so I can send you that link too. To that particular one, it's an after-school animated video of the conversation, which is really, really helpful to kind of get in context of how it's happened so quickly in a matter of 4 or 5 generations. We've gotten to this place. It's really quite interesting. That's the one piece of media that I tend to send people to because it
Okay.
really informed my view and why I wrote the book.
Yeah. Well, those are great, and I will be sure to link those in our show notes for folks who want to learn more. And of course, the book itself, which I'm assuming can be found on the most major platforms. And
Yeah,
I know I listened to it, so it's an audiobook as well as a physical
yeah,
book.
right. Yeah, Scott Brick did the audio book with George Newbern. They're both really great narrators. That's all over the place. The physical book is available on all. It's out of the bookstores now because the physical one came out a couple years ago, but you can get it
Hmm.
on wherever your Amazon or wherever you choose to buy books, you can get the physical
Mhm.
book or the ebook if you'd like to. It's those three formats, but it's
Perfect.
definitely an interesting read. I think, as especially given. The side note here is Woody Harrelson did the was the first to endorse it. He's like the first one
Mm.
that read it and said, "Oh gosh, this could be something."
Yeah.
And that was actually that was quite a big push for me. Not, and I didn't think it was going to affect the book sales, and all the sales of this book anyway go to a nonprofit to support
Mhm.
farmers. Like we're not making money off of this, but like the to have Woody, who he narrated this documentary called Kiss the Ground, I believe. I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
what
I
it was
heard
called.
about that one.
Yeah. Oh, you would love it. It's really, really good.
I need
But
to
anyway,
watch it.
yeah, to have that voice say, give validation to what I was
Mm.
doing with this book. I don't know. It kind of crossed a bridge for me and said, okay, you know what we're talking about here matters, and it's a story that deserves to be heard, and I'll put it out there. And that was like one of the
Mhm.
main pushes for me as I was writing, because he read a really early draft, and I said, okay,
Mm.
let's go all in,
That's all
see
I
what
need,
happens.
yeah. A little
Yeah.
push.
So yeah.
That's great. Super exciting. Well, I guess we'll move on now to our green life hack portion of the show. This is just where we each offer one thing that people can do to live more sustainably. And I know you've offered several throughout the talk, but is there anything else you would offer to folks, or do you want to just reiterate anything you've said for something they can do if they're just struggling to figure out where to get started?
I totally blew that already because I kind of answered it. With the, I think that the biggest takeaway, sorry, not takeaway, but the biggest actionable thing is the smallest, which I would really encourage people, especially if it's a green life hack, to try growing something.
Mm.
Just in a little tiny 3 inch, container.
Hmm.
And it doesn't
Yeah.
matter what it is, but just try growing something and see what that's like, and see what that you might have done it in third grade, when you were drawing stuff in school. Who
Lima
knows?
beans or
But
something, yeah.
exactly. But just try doing it. I'm not talking about like full herb garden or anything. I'm just like,
Hmm.
just try putting something on your bedroom windowsill or your kitchen windowsill, and
Hmm.
watching that thing pop up out of the soil, and see what that does for your mental state and your sense of connectivity. I
Yeah.
think you'd be surprised. That's the one thing I would say.
Perfect. Well, mine is kind of related to that in the conversation about food, and that's just to try making your own basics. Whether it's like I bake a lot, so a lot of recipes call for all-purpose flour, and that's literally just like flour with baking powder and salt. And they sell
Yeah.
it separately at the store, but you can also just make it yourself and have it on hand. Save a lot of money, save the packaging. So things like that. I've started trying to make my own granola. Haven't quite figured that out yet, but
I
it's
tried.
just
That is hard. That is hard,
I
hard,
burnt it.
hard.
Yeah, it wasn't
Yeah.
great, but I'm experimenting, and that's the whole thing. It's not always going to be great, but you usually have the ingredients like in separate pieces in your house already. So if you just look up recipes for different things, I wrote bread. I'm not great at bread. I do bake, but I have to figure out, a good recipe for bread. Broth, berry compotes. There's a lot of things that we just take for granted we can go buy, but then you could also just make it easy enough. So I'm not saying we need to all go homestead and churn our own butter, but
Yeah. Right.
there are little things I think we could do ourselves and save the packaging and the money because a lot of the stuff is just outrageously priced. So that's my green
Yeah.
life hack
Well,
to try.
there's also a certain satisfaction, right, in doing that
Yeah.
yourself. Like that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's ridiculous how proud I feel when I like make the simplest thing and I'm like,
Yeah.
I am on the Oregon Trail living, like self-sufficiently
That's
because I
cool.
made some granola or something.
Yeah. Right.
Anyways, well, Alex, thank you again for being on the show. One more time, do you want to plug the book, where we can find you and or anything you're working on right now online?
Sure. The book is called Ordinary Soil. The sequel just came out actually, which is called
Oh,
Analog Sun. That's in all the airport bookstores now through the end of December nationally, and then that audiobook should be out in the next couple days. And you can find out more about those. I'm doing the third one I'm in the middle of now, but everything's at my website, which is Alex, Alex Woodard, WOODARD.com. I got off social media probably 3 or 4 years ago now, so there's no handle there, which is like the best thing I ever did in my life. But but you can. I'm very active on the website. I like if you send me an email, I answer it, and I try to keep that as kind of the community. So check out alexwoodard.com for the books and the music and everything else that we're doing here.
Perfect. Yeah, and you can find the show on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky, and as I mentioned earlier, on buymeacoffee.com if you're interested in supporting the show, and YouTube, and anywhere you listen to podcasts. And you can find me personally on Instagram and Blue Sky at Het's Gonna Be Me. Thanks again, Alex, and for everyone listening, have a great rest of your day.